I lost a lot of time, so let's jump now into some of those 20 examples in the Urban Master Planning Handbook. We start with, again, one of those projects that many people wouldn't consider to be best practice, right? It's Stuyvesant Town in New York, one of the earliest urban renewal projects in the US and specifically in New York. So Robert Moses has been not only behind the construction of the motorway and parkway system in New York, but also behind many of those urban renewal ones. It's not the very first one, but it's the first one to be implemented in a very dense urban context by a private company. And that was actually the whole political background of this endeavor. And several expropriation laws had to be changed in order to make this deal attractive enough for a private developer in order to happen, right? So actually what the city did here in the Lower East Side of New York, and I'm jumping here directly to the work done by the course of this book, Katharina Grön, who has drawn those diagrams, also this one here just to quickly identify where we are. And she was actually doing the same type of analysis drawings for all the 20 examples. So what we can see here is the starting situation of the plot. So blue would be private ownership. Red, if there is one, is actually public ownership. So the first one is the existing situation. The second one would be the change of ownership. So you can see here quite radical. So hardcore expropriation, demolition done by the city of New York. About, I think, 16 plots or even more of the Manhattan grid being just torn down. Even the public ownership of the streets taken away. Everything gathered, given over to a pretty interesting price to MetLife Insurances. At that time, I think the largest private company in the world. And so that's why actually for a certain amount of time this would be red, but it turned actually into private property. So that's why here again you have blue and not red. These are the prescriptions of the master plan. If there is something of the master plan, what I find kind of interesting about this type of urban design is that they can't, at the end of the day, they can't be a reasonable division between the urban design and the architecture, right? Because how interesting would it be here just to work on the urban design and to give the work over to the architect? And how much freedom would the architect still have? So I think that's also something which is quite typical for a lot of post-war urbanism, is this lack of differentiation of architecture and urban design, which I find is often problematic. So you see here, the kind of fake master plan prescriptions, and you see again, in this case, there's not a lot of difference because of the enormous simplicity of the project. And you see the end result and the fact, again, that all of those buildings are in private ownership. So the idea of the building was to prove that urban renewal could be done in a city location by a private developer. What the developer had to do in return of a very favorable acquisition price, he had to limit the rents. So this is actually an example of affordable housing, a lot of that given over with preference to veterans coming back from the war. This was implemented in 46, 47, just after the war. The developer also received a tax cap over several decades. So the deal was actually to pay taxes only on the real estate values before redevelopment. But this area was essentially a slum, or it was considered to be a slum. It means like many owners were not even paying the taxes anymore, right? So it was a very interesting deal for MetLife Insurances. And you can see afterwards, again, repetitive for all the 20 examples, is an analysis of the uses. So here again, very simple because it's residential only. You have some restaurants and shops on the street border, but it's very limited compared to the development area. Then you have green spaces and pathways. You have transport networks, and you have the street network. And once again, what we should not underestimate is, if you look at these images, a certain quality of the green space, which is also very well maintained, And the fact, I believe, that the coverage, the building coverage went down from something like over 80% to 25%. So the change of open space here has been quite drastic, and is definitely also something which has to be mentioned as a quality, even though many post-war mass housing examples do show us that just the sheer existence of open spaces does not necessarily give us a lot of quality. It has something to do with the maintenance and how those open spaces have been designed. In that case, at the end of the day, with a certain success. Architecturally, those examples are quite, those floor plans are quite limited in their originality, but they seem to work. I mean, I've been talking to people who live there, and they seem to be fairly happy with the results. So again, you have recognized this in the two previous books. We are very repetitive in terms of scale approach and aerial urban plans, and the fact that we are showing as much as possible architectural plans of the interior. And here you see a little bit more about the setting. Let's jump to a project. First of all, let's jump in history. What I should mention here, that again, the whole structure of the book is organized according to size. So the smallest project, I believe, actually was one of the London projects, was Broadgate. And the largest projects are the Beijing CBD and La Défense in the suburbs of Paris. And that's some kind of a mid-sized example, still a smaller one. In the presentation, by the way, I'm not following necessarily this size structure, but we found it interesting to realize that obviously the way we structure a project has a lot to do with its size. Much more, and for us it had much more interest than to organize the book, for example, according to chronology. So the oldest example in our book would actually be Belgravia, starting around the 1820s or even a bit before that. And about half of our projects here are still ongoing or not completely finished. So most of the examples are actually quite recent. But we thought it would be unwise to give the impression that there's some kind of a linear development about how we plan our cities. I actually do believe that we are coming back towards a slightly more complex way of developing our cities, which would probably be closer to Belgravia or to, let's say, the Haussmann interventions in Paris, rather than what you have seen here in Stuyvesant Town, right? So there is no linear development, which I believe, again, it's a long topic, but it's quite fundamental to understand. So here we are in a famous example of ecological architecture. I think Vauban became, one of the first places to visit in Germany, but worldwide, actually, to see early examples of passive houses and of ecological architecture and urbanism. The point that I would like to make in this example is actually, again, that there's a very direct relationship between the process and the reason that there is ecological architecture in this example. And it's not only the fact that the city wanted to have ecological architecture here somehow as a showcase of this green city, Freiburg, in Germany. So, Freiburg is in southwestern Germany, a beautiful city. And the background historically of this development, and that's also where the name comes from, is from the French barracks here. The French army, which left, like the British and the American one, a German ground after the reunification in the early 1990s. So it became ownership of the federal estate and was bought by the city in order to implement an urban development project. And they organized a competition, an open competition, won by a master planners, Koloff and Koloff, from Stuttgart. You can see here, if you compare the competition, the winning competition entry with the final plan, that there have been quite a few changes. So essentially, the master plan had a certain notion of being an ideas competition, and the city afterwards implemented, the further adjustment to the reality of also the land ownership issues in that area. So we start, this is the plan of the area when it was still used as barracks. So this was in public ownership. Afterwards, here we can see how the land ownership structure has completely changed. So we have an example here quite extremely going from large scale to small scale, which is very fundamental for the success of this development, and only some of the green areas and maybe some schools have been kept in public ownership. We see here the master plan prescriptions, and we see what has been implemented in reality. So that's essentially kind of a figure ground drawing with public and private indication of the final state here. And again, just not to spend too much time for this example and to show you more, what's really fundamental to understand is that the city made the decision actually to sell the land by auction to a fixed price, right? So they knew how much money they had to spend, for example, for the tram line that the city has built, for the preparation of the ground, the construction of the streets. And once they had a rough estimation, they just said, okay, we have to sell the land for this amount per square meter, and we're going to make our decision according to the program. So we're not going to sell to the person who offers most, but to the person or the developer who is offering the most interesting concept. And what they did here is actually because it is a green city, they thought, well, we would like to test a new concept, which at that time was arising not only in Freiburg, but in other places, and has been actually become quite fashionable in all of Germany and also in other places of the world, is actually selling. So the preference was giving to building groups. So these are individuals that team up in order to design and build a small-scale multifamily building. And because those people had similar interests, actually they often decided to invest more money in ecological technologies than the average developer could ever have done. And again, the point that I'm always making here is that the average developer will always try to make marketing with the fact, obviously, that they are trying to, to implement the newest technologies. But to be fair enough, I think there's a certain limitation of what he can do, because he cannot necessarily know how much the future apartment condo buyer is actually is willing to invest in these technologies. So maybe he's willing to invest 15% more, but that's maybe the maximum that the developer would like to spend more. But those people here, because they were individuals teaming up, and most of them had like a very strongly developed green conscience, they were sometimes going further. So they just said, okay, for us, it's the biggest project of our life, and we believe in green technologies. So we are just putting a maximum, as much as we can afford, into the newest technologies. And that's actually the fascinating example, where here the process of making that decision, selling by auction to those people, is very key in order to achieve the ecological result. I'm not saying that's something that has to be copied everywhere, that we're going to be successful everywhere, but it's just interesting to see how those two things relate. And it's not only an architectural issue, and it's not only an engineering or technical question. So here again, those are some of those examples here. This is one of those building groups, and some others that you can see here. So the architecture is quite different from type to type. So the building is set up, and once it's finished, essentially the final legal status will be the same of a condominium, right? So every person which formed was part of the building group at the end of the day will just be the owner of his single unit. So very different. Funnily enough, it's by chance that the both are together. It's another German example, but it's also like the third one in this book, funnily enough, which is Potsdamer Platz. So all of them are closely linked to the reunification. And so again, that's an example which started just after 89 in the early 1990s. It's in the suburbs of Potsdam, so it's not in West Germany, but in former East Germany. Suburbs of Potsdam, and a private developer with the help of the city was buying up former agricultural land. I think there were 80 landowners, so I think the city helped in using their preemptive purchasing rights. I forgot the right word for that, and was giving everything over to this single developer, who then again did something similar at the end of the day to Stuyvesant Down, built most of it as affordable housing, affordable multifamily housing, and rental housing. So actually he did not sell those properties, but rents them until today. And I think the major link here to reunification at the end of the day is the fact that there were major subsidies for construction and affordable housing after the reunification. First of all, because there was a need for those houses, but even more so than the need, there was a need to have investment as such and to have construction. So this project would never have been possible without major subsidies from the state, and I think that's also an important information, just to appreciate this question of multifamily developments in suburban areas. How much help do you actually need to make them worthwhile? Obviously, this has a lot to do with land value, so that's something which maybe works well in the suburbs of London because people have to pay that much in the center. But once you go to other cities and you're trying to implement multifamily housing, often it's very difficult to convince the private sector to really do that. And here in this case, the private sector did it only because of those enormous subsidies. And so again, you have a certain parallel to Stuyvesant Town, because in that case, even though it wasn't the city center, it was profitable only because the city was giving over the land to such interesting conditions. Here, the master plan, it wasn't an open competition. It was just the owner who invited, I think, 7 or 8 practices. One of them was Creer and Cole, so Rob Creer and Christoph Cole. They won with this, I think, they won with an earlier sketch, but that's essentially what has been implemented. So they afterwards have been chosen in order to define the urban rules for form-based codes, that's how you call it in the US. And each building would be implemented by another practice. So it's a quite interesting, very different from that point of view from Stuyvesant Town. So you don't have one person trying to play the architect and the urban designer at the same time, but actually you have one urban designer being chosen to define the rules, and afterwards, I think, all of that being implemented by over 30 different practices. So there's a certain schizophrenia about this way of working. You still have one single owner, so it's very different from Freiburg-Vauban, where actually the land was sold to different small-scale owners. So you still have very much a large-scale approach, but then afterwards you're trying to solve this problem of boredom and repetition through the fact that you are actually giving over the work to different architectural practices. So it's a kind of an artificial way of doing, and it's also one of the few examples, it's mentioned to be one of the few European examples of new urbanism, because that's a way of development which is used quite often in the US. And actually my university in Miami is quite well known to have implemented, not the university, but my dean and her office and many other people linked to new urbanism are well known for having developed this kind of development and design logic. Rather design logic, by the way, than development logic. And here again, I think I explained it already. You can see how this has been implemented. And I quite like the project. You shouldn't forget, again, it's affordable housing, so I think there was a certain limit of what was possible to be done. The quality of the landscaping is quite beautiful. Again, comparing it with a project like Stuyvesant Town or Cartier, the project in the Parisian banlieue, is actually the differentiation not only between the urban designer and the architect, but also the landscape architect, right? So the landscape architect was actually a separate structure, which today is essentially a very normal way of approaching things, but it wasn't necessarily 30 years ago. And you can see here, some of the images of the built results. You can see here the quality of the courtyards. It's quite beautiful the way, the cars are kind of hidden from the green areas and from the public realm. It's something which has been quite well done. Here, one of the few larger scale examples where actually SOM had been invited. Funnily enough, I was surprised to see SOM working in Kirchsteigfeld, close to Potsdam. But they also did a project in KPF, by the way, also. Both of them not maybe the most successful of the whole project.